In this video, we are going to take a look at the very first Christian movement, all the way back to Jesus, and how they lived and believed in a theology drastically different from what Christianity later evolved into. Our greatest source for knowledge on this subject is the Christian Bible itself, mainly the book of Acts, which provides much detail about the early and evolving movement. That is, if you're willing to lend any historical credence to these books. I would like to begin with Acts chapter 5, where we find a very telling story. The disciples of Jesus were jailed and then brought to the Jewish Supreme Court before the high priest. Essentially, the Jewish leaders at that time were jealous or intimidated by this small messianic group that was gaining steam, and felt these fellow Jewish brothers needed a little tough love. But in a twist of fate, a Jewish rabbi and a teacher of the Jewish law named Gamaliel stepped into the issue and says, "Gentlemen, put these men aside. Leave them alone," he says. "Do not do anything to them." This is very eye-opening for historians because here we have a head of the Jewish court pleading for these Christian men. In this story, there is no sign or evidence that early Christians were practicing or teaching anything contrary to or outside the lines of mainstream Judaism. Christianity at this time was just another fringe Jewish messianic movement, and there wasn't anything particularly wrong with claiming yourself or anybody else to be the Messiah. It wasn't a sin. In fact, it may have been a noble title to go for at that time in world history. In this passage, Gamaliel also makes reference to a few other early messianic movements. Many Jewish men had stepped up, claiming to be the Messiah at that time. You could call it pop culture. Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, also mentions several Jews who claimed to be the Messiah and gathered large followings. They rose up and were squashed by the Romans and ultimately died out. You see, the Jews were under Roman occupation, and claiming to be the Messiah, which according to Old Testament lore would be a king of the Jews, was risky business. So here we have Gamaliel, head of the Jewish court, citing no wrongdoing and essentially pleads for the disciples' case. He ends by saying something very profound. He reminds the court of these other movements by saying, "Look what happened to these other guys. They were dismantled by the Romans. If this Jesus movement is godly, then you cannot stop it. And if it is not of God, then it will fall apart all by itself." Wow! Now Christians read this story and they get very excited. They will say, "Look, we're still here 2,000 years later. Isn't that the greatest evidence in the world that the Christian faith is true?" Well, yes, it sounds good, but historically speaking, it could not be further from the truth. The early movement did die, and it died quickly and died big. Let's take a closer look at history and what really happened. What was this early Christian movement that Gamaliel, the head of the Jewish court, was addressing? Who was Peter? Who was James? Were they pork-eating, Sunday-gathering Baptists that worshipped the Messiah and believed in a Trinity? No, they certainly did not believe in a Trinity or teach that Jesus was God. In fact, in the three synoptics, better known as Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus never once referred to himself as God. Only the fourth gospel, the book of John, written decades later from the original three synoptics, began to imply such an idea, an evolution we can see occurring historically that developed 3 to 4 decades after Jesus. This very first Christian movement could not have reflected Christian theology as it is today, or even the Christianity that evolved within 20 to 40 years later. If Peter and James were preaching and practicing the Christianity we are now familiar with, Gamaliel would have burned them at the stake for blasphemy and teaching heresy. If Peter was someone who worshipped Jesus or no longer kept the laws of the Torah, it would not have been possible for the head of the Jewish court to say, "Leave these guys alone, they are doing nothing wrong." No way. He would have said, "These men are the greatest violators of Judaism possible. They are denying the Torah and practicing idolatry." This story in Acts only makes sense if the very first Christian movement was totally consistent with Judaism, and these Jewish leaders were merely concerned over competitors rising for power. We must remember our Sunday school stories, how Jesus was a Jew who taught regularly in the synagogues. Jesus never said he was flushing Judaism down the toilet. In fact, in Matthew chapter 5, he says, "Think not that I have come to nullify the Torah." He also says, "Do not think that any of the commandments, the least jot or the least tittle, should be passing away. If anyone," he says, "teaches that the least of the commandments become nullified, they will become the least in the kingdom." In the book of Mark, the earliest and first written gospel, in chapter 10, Jesus is approached by someone who says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit the kingdom of heaven?" Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? There is none good but God." Here is clear separation. Jesus never referred to himself as being good, perfect, and certainly not God. Nobody at that time would even think of such a heretical idea. Jesus continued, "And if you want to go to heaven, keep the commandments." Nowhere in the three synoptics, the earliest written sources for the life of Jesus, does he ever say you have to believe in the Messiah or that he would die for sins. These are Christian theologies that developed on a much later stage. Rather, every word out of the mouth of Jesus, every parable, speaks of keeping the Torah and or helping the poor and the needy. These were the only and sole criteria for getting into the kingdom at that time. In the 23rd chapter of Matthew, Jesus says that the scribes and Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses. Therefore, everything they teach you shall observe and follow. Christians today who do not eat kosher and fail to observe the Sabbath on Saturday are in complete opposition to everything Jesus taught and believed. So then, what was this early Jesus movement about? What made it different? Well, nothing at all, really. If you read through the Gospels, one fact emerges very clearly. The main teaching of Jesus, the words that came out of his mouth most frequently, was a very popular message already flourishing at that time. A message also spoken of by John the Baptist prior to Jesus. The kingdom of God is at hand. Meaning, these early Jewish people believed the present world order was going to end. War, strife, and a brutal Roman rule was soon to be over. Israel and the Jewish people will become sovereign and be a light unto the world. Jesus, among many others, likely believed he was the chosen one to become king of the Jews and sit at the head of this utopian era. He didn't need to do or change anything, but simply claim the title, as all Jews believed all these things would be accomplished by the Jewish God. You can read this lore in detail within the Old Testament scriptures. The prophecies, of course, have all failed, but just keep getting reinterpreted generation after generation. Once the Christian church moved completely out from Judaism, invented a new concept for a Messiah, and essentially became a new religion consisting primarily of pagan Greeks and Romans, the original Jewish movement presented by Jesus had died out. Gamaliel and the Jewish court would no longer feel intimidation or jealousy over this new and ever-changing Christian theology, as it gradually became radicalized by the Greeks. And this new movement no longer belonged to or had any affiliation with Judaism. The New Testament is not even written in Hebrew. The entire canon was penned in Greek. Very few Jews ever adopted Christianity. Therefore, it twisted and converted in the hands of pagans to become a completely retooled and drastically different theology, more resembling Greek and Roman spiritual concepts, such as heaven and hell. Interestingly enough, Christianity remained broken and was unable to unify or gain traction for several centuries. It wasn't until Constantine, hundreds of years later, probably influenced by his mother Helen to embrace Christianity, that the movement finally got legs and was able to become the pop religion that it is today. Constantine saw how Christianity was in turmoil, having a large variety of groups all disagreeing with each other. Constantine had the power and influence to gather theologians together at the Council of Nicaea and work out who Jesus was and what Christianity meant. Constantine didn't only standardize all the wild and various Christian doctrines with the Nicene Creed, but also instituted a policy to round up every group that rejected or disagreed with the council's final verdict, and had all of their writings destroyed. Two of the more popular groups who were wiped out were the Nazarenes and the Ebionites. These were authentic Jewish Christians, descendants of the earliest followers of Jesus, who held on to the original teachings of the earliest disciples. We know about these early Ebionites and Nazarenes by how they were attacked by other Christians later on. They were attacked for believing in one God and rejecting the Trinity. They did not worship Jesus. They were ridiculed for getting circumcised, keeping kosher, observing all the commandments of the Torah, and only reading the Old Testament. Basically living and practicing what Jesus commanded. They were Jews who were persecuted by the Roman and Greek Christian pagans. With their eradication, the last remnants of the original movement took a last and final breath. Looking back to Gamaliel and the Jewish court, very little has changed for them. Jews have remained generally the same, never wavering, before, during, and after Jesus. Christians, however, reconstructed and piggybacked Judaism, so naturally they like to boast and point out how there are 2 billion Christians and only 12 million Jews. How can 2 billion Christians be wrong and only 12 million Jews be right, a Christian will say. When asked this question, a popular Jewish rabbi replied with a brilliant answer. The rabbi responded to the question with a question. He said to the Christian, "Let's go back to the day before Jesus. There basically was a whole world of pagans and a small group of Jews. Who was right back then? The whole pagan world or this small group of Jews? And the Christian answered, the small group of Jews, of course, were right, and the whole pagan world was wrong. The Jew then replied once again, there is your answer. Why should I think the whole world would be right when it has always been wrong? The peer pressure placed on Jews by Christians to embrace Christianity because of its large numbers has never worked, not at any time in the past, nor today. So how did it happen? How did the original Jesus movement evolve so drastically away from Judaism? How did we end up with the Christian theology we have today? It's actually not at all difficult to understand. Christianity begins with a dead Messiah. The original concept of a Messiah in Jewish lore was not a dead one. Therefore, a Jewish theology had to be either abandoned or reinterpreted. It's much easier to reinterpret than to abandon. The psychology involved is fascinating. In 1956, a great social psychologist named Leon Festinger wrote a book called When Prophecy Fails. He analyzed a movement of a psychic channeler who claimed she received messages from outer space, and who made a proclamation that the world will soon be destroyed by a flood on a certain date. She attained many followers who believed her. They were saving up tuna fish cans and preparing safe places, and what Festinger wanted to see is what would happen when this date came and passed with no flood. What's going to happen to her group of followers? What Festinger did was he sent in some graduates, infiltrated the group to see what was going to happen, and his thesis was that the prophecy would not come true, and that the group will not fall apart. Instead, they would become even more aggressive at trying to convert people after the prophecy failed. That's the thesis of his book. The psychological principle at play is known as cognitive dissonance, and he proved how it is quite predictable. When there is a problem or a contradiction between what you believe and reality, you will adjust your beliefs to fit the reality. This is exactly what happened, just as Festinger predicted it would. We might think that her followers would see her as a false prophet, a hoax, and that they would all abandon the group, but instead, they fabricated new narratives to explain away any failures, and became even more on fire for these new convictions. In 1648, Sabbatai Zevi, a great Jewish mystic, claimed he was the Messiah, and gathered a huge following among Jews in Turkey and even parts of Europe. A few Jewish lore buffs had predicted at that time the Messiah would come. It didn't mean that he was going to save your soul and grant you a ticket into heaven if you believe. No, this was the original Jewish concept that exists to this day, that all of the Jews are going to pack their bags and move back to Israel to live in peace in the new utopian kingdom set up by God. Many people had sold their homes and possessions in preparation to follow Sabbatai Zevi, but then he was captured by the Turks and thrown into prison. Under pain of death, he was forced to convert to Islam. Christians likewise treated Jews in this same manner, forcing them to convert to Christianity or be put to death. I did a video on this subject. They were called the Marranos. So now this guy, Sabbatai Zevi, who they believed was a Jewish Messiah, is in prison and converted to Islam. But there were thousands of Jews who followed him and could not accept this news because they had invested so much resource and emotional energy believing in this movement. It became nearly impossible to abandon the belief. So they began creating new narratives. Well, the guy in jail was not really Sabbatai Zevi. He's a double. The real Sabbatai Zevi went up to heaven, much like Jesus, who floated up into the clouds. They claimed Sabbatai Zevi will come down soon to bring them up into heaven. They even found passages in the Old Testament proving that the Messiah was supposed to convert to another religion. Ironically, you can comb through the Old Testament to support just about any theology you can dream up. It isn't hard to do. If you want to find Jesus in there, just put your Jesus glasses on and you're bound to see plenty of things that will pop out or lend support to your ideas, even your wildest imaginations. You can do this with any book for anything. Have you ever wondered why Jesus prophecies, farmed from out of the Old Testament, are always out of context and or very vague in detail? Well, that's why. Christians just drop a hook into the Old Testament scriptures and start fishing for anything that sounds like their guy. In Long Island during the 1980s, a Lutheran pastor named Jack Hickman had a small church that grew under charismatic and fringe leadership, with thousands eventually joining. He even enticed many Jews as he prescribed living a Jewish lifestyle. Years later, he was found to be a pedophile. He had been molesting the young boys in the church. They also found out he lied about his prior life's history. You would think when people learned he was a liar and a pervert, they would just leave. But no, nearly half of the church stayed. They were unable to accept that they had spent the last 15 years of their life being led by a false and perverted leader. So they began teaching that this was all part of the plan. They pointed out Jewish scriptures that appeared to be speaking about a leader having relations with boys. Cognitive dissonance is no joke. When it is too difficult to admit your lifelong and cherished beliefs are wrong, especially under tremendous investments, you'll do anything not to give them up. So after selling everything you have, leaving home and family behind, following for years a man who you believed to be the Messiah, believing he was leading you into a new utopian kingdom, but suddenly becomes a dead Messiah, it becomes impossible to admit you were wrong. Cognitive dissonance kicks in full strength. Okay, they said, he died, but he'll come back. There will be a second coming. But the belief was not that Jesus would return in 500 years, 800 years, or thousands of years later. If you read the New Testament carefully, the belief was that he would come back in less than one generation. But after a generation passes and Jesus hadn't returned, now what? Well, back to the drawing board, to reinterpreting failed prophecy. But why did he even have to die to begin with? He must have died for good reason. Ah, of course. He died to atone for our sins. People had been practicing and believing in human and animal blood sacrifices atoning for sins throughout nearly all religions at that time. It was a widespread Bronze and Iron Age theology. Even the Old Testament tells the story of a suffering servant in the book of Isaiah, who dies for the atonement of others. Jews believed this was speaking of the nation of Israel, as it is often described as a person or a servant, and they bear the burdens and pain for the rest of the world to be made clean. This is why they think they are special or chosen, and because of all the pain and suffering they have had to endure, that someday they will be brought high and sit at the head of the future kingdom of God. Neither is this passage in Isaiah a messianic passage or a prophecy predicting the death of a future Messiah. Not at all. I made a video called Fulfillment Prophecies, which highlights in detail the multitude of problems with these Old Testament scriptures fitting the Jesus narrative. Essentially, a brand new concept for a Messiah was invented to accommodate a dead Messiah. There was a looming problem, however. Why would Jesus' death be special? There were thousands of Jews crucified by Romans. What was so special about Jesus' death? This led to deification, resulting in a permanent separation from Judaism. Christianity now became pagan idolatry. Jesus' death was special because he was no ordinary human being. He was actually God himself. Okay, but how could he be God if his father was a man? But his father wasn't a man. He was born of a virgin. They even found an Old Testament verse in which they mistranslated to produce a virgin birth, which I also cover in Fulfillment Prophecies, video number 9 of my 16-video series. The early Christian church did a lot of convenient editing of Hebrew scriptures to fit their new narratives. Jews have expressed disappointment over such activities throughout the years. Regardless, the original movement of Jesus was now completely dismantled and became something entirely different within only a few decades after Jesus' death. So what happens next for this early movement, now that it has developed coping mechanisms and effectively reinterpreted and reestablished itself as a new religion? This becomes a new chapter in Christian theology, whereas Peter and James are dwarfed by the new and aspiring Paul, who is ready to take over and take control. Paul now becomes one of the main advocates for Christianity, even though he had never even met Jesus. Paul realizes that the Jewish people are not buying into this newly crafted Jesus narrative or magical tales that were being told. So in Acts chapter 13, Paul says, "Since the Jews are rejecting all of these new Christian ideologies, I am going to go to the Gentiles, the pagans." Paul builds his ministry around converting Gentiles, the Greeks and the Romans. By doing so, he is presented with great pressure to make this new religion more palatable to non-Jews. And that's why we see a grafting into Christianity a lot of paganism. Christmas, Easter, the deification of Jesus and a Trinity, and images of Jesus feeling and looking like Greek gods. Christians are doing this very exact same thing today when they go into India to proselytize. They will decorate Jesus up to look like a guru or an Indian mystic. Clearly, Paul would have a difficult time selling Christianity if paintings or graven images of God were an abomination, or if the men must get circumcised, keep the commandments of the Torah, or eat kosher. In light of these major changes, Paul's message starts leaning toward an anti-Jewish sentiment. The New Testament begins to paint the Jews as sons of the devil. All the while, Jesus has been transformed into the style and image of a Greek man, a god, and is being worshipped as part of a trinity. Within less than 1 century, The Christian church is persecuting anyone observing the Torah and begins a long reign of terror, including horrifying violence throughout the ages inflicted on Jews and non-believers abroad. The goal of Christianity is to convert the entire world. For most Christianity's history, believers were kept in the dark concerning its true origins in history. They didn't have Bibles like we do today, and only privileged men were allowed to read from them. Many people were killed for trying to translate the Bible or put it into the hands of commoners. The church went to great lengths to keep its sheep in the dark. But the truth cannot be contained forever. It will wait patiently for a crack and bubble to the surface eventually. And it has bubbled to the surface. Christianity is now under the microscope of a modern and free world, and is crumbling quickly because of it. It will continue to crumble and will not recover. Stay strong and wise, my friends.
I don't believe in masquerades. I don't believe that you're okay. I don't believe that God will save. Only you can solve your problems. I don't care what they sold you. They are not here to hold you.